The year is 1348. Imagine standing on a dock in massive, bustling London. The air smells of salt, tar, and rotting fish. You hear the creak of wood as a ship from France glides into the harbour. The sailors throw ropes to the dockhands. It looks like a normal Tuesday. It looks like business as usual. But inside the hold of that ship, specifically in the fur of the rats scurrying between the grain sacks, an invisible passenger has arrived. Most of us know this story. We know about the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, nearly half of Europe died. It was the apocalypse. It was the end of the world. But here is the strange part. The world did not end. The sun rose again in 1352. The survivors inherited the land. They married. They rebuilt the walls. They thought the nightmare was finished. They thought God had punished them once, and now the debt was paid. They were wrong. Welcome to the London Gritty Chronicles. Today, we are not looking at the first great explosion of the plague. We are looking at what happened 20, 30, and 40 years later. We are looking at the years between 1370 and 1400. This is the era when the apocalypse became something much worse. It became a routine. It became normal. In this documentary, we will explore a profound transformation. We will see how medieval society moved from screaming in fear to writing down rules. We will watch as chaos transformed into order. We will see how the repeated punches of the plague forced towns to invent the systems we use today. This is the story of how fear turned into institutions. Throughout this journey, pay close attention to the vocabulary we use. History is not just about dates. It is about the words people chose to describe their reality. Today, we focus on the language of administration and control. You will learn how to speak about rules, records, and councils. Let us go back to the 1360s and 1370s. The first wave of the pestilence was a shock. It was like a lightning strike, sudden, violent, and blinding. Survivors described it as a great silence. There were not enough living to bury the dead. But by the 1360s, a new generation had grown up. Children born after the Great Mortality were reaching adulthood. The economy was recovering. The fields were green again. Then, the rumors started. Travelers coming from the east whispered the same terrifying news. It is back. In 1361, the pestilence returned. This was called the Pestis Secunda, or the Second Plague. It was particularly cruel because it seemed to target the young, those who had no immunity. Then it returned again in 1369, and again in the mid-1370s. Imagine the psychological impact. If your house burns down once, you think it is a tragedy. If it burns down every 10 years, you realize you need to change how you build the house. This realization is the core of our story. In the 1370s, the mood in Europe shifted. The people of London, Florence, and Venice stopped looking at the sky, waiting for divine intervention. They started looking at the ground. They started looking at their streets, their trash, and their neighbors. They realized that prayer was essential for the soul, but it was not stopping the bodies from piling up in the streets. This brings us to our first key historical concept, the outbreak. Listen to how I use this word. An outbreak is a sudden occurrence of something unwelcome, such as war or disease. In the 1370s, the plague was no longer a single event. It was a series of outbreaks. You might say, the town council feared a new outbreak in the summer. Or, they prepared for the next outbreak by closing the gates. In English, when we talk about disease appearing suddenly, we use the verb to break out. The plague broke out in the poor districts first. This repetition changed everything. Because the disease kept coming back, society had to adapt. You cannot live in a permanent state of panic. Panic is exhausting. Panic is expensive. If you are a merchant selling wool or a baker selling bread, you cannot stop working every time someone gets sick. You need a system. You need stability. So the towns began to organize. This transition was slow and painful. It did not happen overnight. In the 1370s, London was still a place of immense filth. We must understand the sensory reality of a medieval city to understand why the changes were so radical. The streets were narrow, often no wider than a cart. Overlooking these streets were the upper stories of timber houses. Underfoot, the ground was a mixture of mud, animal dung, and discarded food. There were no underground sewers. A gutter ran down the middle of the street. If you were a butcher, you threw the blood and guts into the river or the street. If you were a tanner making leather, you used urine and dangerous chemicals, which flowed into the same water people drank. For centuries, this was accepted. It was just how life was. The smell was the smell of the city. But as the outbreaks continued, a new theory began to take hold among the educated elite and the desperate commoners. They believed in miasma. Miasma is an important historical term. It comes from an old Greek word meaning pollution. In the medieval mind, the plague was not caused by bacteria. They did not have microscopes. They did not know what a germ was. They believed the air itself was corrupt. Bad smells, rotting meat, stagnant water, unwashed bodies were the invisible vehicle of death. If the air was the killer, then the solution was not just prayer. The solution was cleaning. This is where the fear turns into action. This is where the institution begins to form. In 1371, King Edward III of England looked at London and was disgusted. He did not see a thriving capital. He saw a death trap. He issued a command. He ordered the mayor of London to remove the filth from the streets. Listen to the language of authority here. The king did not ask. He did not suggest. He mandated. To mandate means to give an official order. The king mandated that the streets be cleaned. This command was one of the first steps toward what we now call public health. It was clumsy. It was hard to enforce. But it was a start. It established a new principle. The government has a right and a duty to control the environment to save lives. Before this era, health was a private matter. If you were sick, it was between you, your doctor, and God. But in the 1370s, health became a public matter. Leaving rotting fish on the dock was not just messy. You were endangering the community. You were creating miasma. You were a criminal. The authorities began to hire men to enforce these new rules. They were called rakers. Their job was exactly what it sounds like. They raked the muck. They loaded it onto carts. They took it outside the city walls. It seems simple to us today. We have garbage trucks and sanitation departments. In the 14th century, This was a revolutionary administrative challenge. Who pays the rakers? Who checks their work? Who punishes the people who throw trash back into the street? To answer these questions, the city needed more than just a king's command. It needed a structure. It needed a council. A council is a group of people chosen to make decisions or give advice. The city council met to discuss the sanitation crisis. In London, the mayor and aldermen, the high-ranking officials, began to meet more frequently. They were no longer just discussing taxes or trade disputes. They were discussing survival. They were writing the first chapters of a rule book that would eventually become modern law. But there was a problem. London was a city of liberty. Merchants hated rules. They hated being told what to do with their waste. It cost money to dispose of things properly. It was cheaper to throw it in the river. So there was a conflict. On one side, the fear of death. On the other side, the desire for profit and freedom. This tension defined the late 1300s. It was a battle between the old, chaotic freedom and the new, strict order. The outbreaks of the 1370s proved that the old way was suicide. The death tolls were too high. The labor force was vanishing. The fields were lying empty because there were no peasants to harvest the wheat. The price of food spiked. The economy wobbled. The authorities realized they needed to be aggressive. They needed to record who was dying. They needed to stop the movement of sick people. They needed to standardize the response. We are seeing the birth of the institution. An institution is a large, important organization or established law or practice. The plague forced the creation of new medical institutions. In the next part of our story, we will travel south. We will leave the muddy streets of London and go to the sun-baked coast of the Adriatic Sea. We will visit a city that made a decision so radical, so unprecedented, that it changed the vocabulary of the entire world. We are going to talk about a specific number of days. We are going to talk about the number 40. But before we leave London, remember the feeling of the 1370s. The initial scream of terror has faded into a dull, constant dread. The people know the enemy is coming back. They know they cannot stop the wind. But they are starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, if they organize, clean, and write down the rules, they might survive. The silence of the first plague is over. Now, we hear the scratching of quills on parchment. The bureaucrats are getting to work. One word changed the history of travel forever. It is a word you know well. You likely used it recently. That word is quarantine. But in the 1370s, it was not a word. It was a number. We are now in the Republic of Ragusa, which today is the stunning city of Dubrovnik in Croatia. It is 1377. The sun is beating down on the white stone walls of the city. The Adriatic Sea is a deep, shimmering blue. A merchant ship from Venice approaches the harbor, its sails heavy with the wind. The captain expects to dock. He expects to unload his silk and spices. He expects to drink wine in a tavern by sunset. Instead, an armed guard boat blocks his path. The guard yells a command. The ship cannot enter. The captain argues. He is healthy. His crew is healthy. They have money. But the guard does not care about money. He points to a small rocky island miles away from the city walls. He tells the captain to go there and wait. "For how long?" the captain asks. 30 days, the guard replies. This moment marks a monumental shift in human history. This is the birth of the ordinance. Let us pause and look at this word. An ordinance is a formal rule or law made by a city or local government. The Great Council passed an ordinance to block the ships. Violating the ordinance resulted in a heavy fine. Before 1377, when a plague ship arrived, the response was emotional. People ran away, or they prayed, or they burned the ship. It was chaotic, but the Great Council of Ragusa did something cold, calculated, and brilliant. They removed the emotion. They replaced fear with a system. They wrote it down in their Green Book of Laws. Veniens de locis pestiferis non intret Ragusium. Those coming from plague-infested places shall not enter Ragusa. This was not a suggestion. It was a legal wall. Initially, the waiting period was 30 days, or a Trentino. Why 30? Doctors observed the disease moved quickly. A sick crewman would likely be dead within a month. If the crew was still alive after 30 days, the ship was safe. It was a brutal, biological filter. The island became a waiting room for death. But soon, 30 days did not seem like enough. The doctors and the council members debated. They looked at religious texts. In the Bible, the number 40 is powerful. The Great Flood lasted 40 days. Jesus fasted in the desert for 40 days. They also looked at Greek medical theories about critical days for a fever. So, they extended the period. They added 10 days. 30 became 40. In Italian, the word for 40 is quaranta. The period of waiting became the quarantino. And thus, the English word quarantine was born. This is a perfect example of the biology to society mirror. The biological reality of the plague, the incubation period, forced society to create a legal structure, the quarantine laws. The success of Ragusa caught the attention of the superpower of the Mediterranean, Venice. Venice was a city built on water and trade. It was the New York City of the Middle Ages. If trade stopped, Venice died. But if the plague entered, Venice also died. The Venetian Senate faced a terrible choice: poverty or pestilence. In the 1380s and 1390s, Venice adopted and expanded isolation. They did not just use a rocky rock, they designated specific islands in their lagoon as isolation hospitals. Here, we must learn the word enforce. To enforce means to compel people to follow a law. The guards enforced the quarantine with weapons. Without enforcement, the rules were useless. This is the key difference between the 1348 outbreak and the outbreaks of the late 1300s. In 1348, there were rules, but no one could enforce them because everyone was dying. By the 1380s, the state had recovered enough to hire police. They had health magistrates, officials whose only job was to hunt for sickness. Imagine the atmosphere in Venice during a quarantine. The Grand Canal is silent. The gondolas are empty. The only movement is the patrol boat of the health magistrates. They are rowing toward a house where a rumor says a child has a fever. They knock on the door. This is not a friendly visit. It is an inspection. If they find a sick person, the family is not asked to leave. They are ordered to leave. The sick are taken to the isolation island. The family might be locked inside their home. The door might be boarded up from the outside. This sounds cruel to modern ears. It was cruel. But in the eyes of the city council, it was necessary math. It was better to sacrifice one family to save the parish. It was better to sacrifice the parish to save the city. This logic, the logic of the greater good, is the foundation of public health. It is not warm. It is not fuzzy. It is a cold, hard calculation made by men in rooms with ledger books. By the year 1400, the major trading cities of Europe were no longer helpless victims. They were fortresses of bureaucracy. They had watchtowers scanning for ships. They had written protocols. They had specific funds allocated for plague defense. But managing the living was only half the problem. As the outbreaks continued to return every 10 or 15 years, the cities faced another grim logistical nightmare. What do you do with the bodies? In the first plague, bodies were thrown into mass trenches. It was anonymous and horrifying. It broke the social contract between the living and the dead. But as fear turned into institutions, the way people counted the dead began to change. The city needed data. They needed to know exactly how many were dying and where. They couldn't fight an enemy they couldn't count. This need for data led to another invention, one that sits on your desk or in your computer right now. It is the humble record. In the next part, we will return to London. We will walk into the dusty offices of the parish clerks. We will see how the need to track the plague created the first mortality statistics. We will see how death became a list, and how that list helped the city survive. In the year 1349, if a merchant died in London, his house was often looted before his body was cold. Neighbors or strangers would kick open the door. They would take the silver cups. They would take the woolen blankets. They would lead the cow away from the backyard. Who was going to stop them? The sheriff was dead. The priest was dead. The man's sons were dead. It was a free-for-all. It was total, legal collapse. But jump forward to the 1380s. The same merchant dies during a smaller outbreak. This time, the scene is different. A man in a dark robe arrives at the house. He does not carry a weapon. He carries a scroll of parchment and a pot of ink. He is a clerk. He stands at the door and demands to see the last will and testament. He walks through the rooms. He counts the silver cups. He touches the blankets. He writes everything down. 1 feather bed, 2 brass pots, 6 silver spoons. This is the birth of the bureaucratic record. In this part, we explore how the chaos of the plague forced society to become obsessed with paperwork. Let us look at the word record. It can be a noun or a verb. As a verb, record, it means to write something down for future reference. The clerk recorded the list of items. As a noun, record, it is the document itself. The record showed who owned the house. Why did this shift happen? Why did the 1370s and 1380s see such an explosion of writing? The answer is simple. Trust had vanished. You could no longer trust that a verbal promise would be kept, because the person who made the promise might be dead next Tuesday. You could not trust memory, because the trauma of the plague made people forget. So, English society moved from an oral culture, where business was done by shaking hands, to a written culture, where business was done by signing names. The clerk became one of the most important figures in the city. A clerk is a person employed to keep records, accounts, and handle correspondence. The parish clerk updated the list of burials. In London, the sheer volume of death created a massive property crisis. When a father died, his land went to his son. But what if the son died a week later, and the grandson a week after that? Who owns the land now? The distant cousin in York? The king? The church? Without clear records, the city would dissolve into endless fighting. The courts were flooded with lawsuits. "That field is mine. No, he promised it to me." To solve this, the institutions stepped in. The church courts, which handled wills, probate, began to demand strict inventories. They forced executors to list every single spoon and every single coin. They created a paper trail that death could not erase. This is a crucial moment in the history of English administration. We see the rise of the register. A register is an official list or book of records. The church maintained a register of all baptisms and burials. Historians looking at the late 14th century see a change in these registers. In the early 1300s, they were often sloppy or incomplete. By the 1400s, they were becoming more standardized. The fear of losing property was a powerful motivator. The wealthy realized that if they wanted their wealth to survive the plague, they had to trust the institution of the law. They had to pay the clerks. This obsession with counting extended to the bodies themselves. In the late 1300s, we see the very early roots of what would later become the bills of mortality. The city authorities needed to know if an outbreak was starting. Rumors were dangerous. Rumors caused panic. Rumors caused markets to close. The mayor needed facts. So the searchers, often older women paid by the parish, were sent to inspect the dead. They had to report the cause of death. Was it a fever? Was it the swelling, the buboes of the plague? Was it old age? They reported to the clerk. The clerk wrote it in the register. The register was shown to the council. This is the biology to society mirror again. The biological need to track the pathogen led to the social invention of data collection. It was primitive. It was often wrong. But the habit was forming. The government was learning to watch the population. This transition was not just about ink and paper. It changed how people spoke. The language of business became sharper. It became rule-based. In the past, you might say, "I give this land to my brother." Now, the clerk would write, "I hereby bequeath the aforementioned tenement to the said recipient, pending the approval of the court." It sounds stiff. It sounds boring. But that stiffness is the sound of safety. When life is fragile, people build walls of heavy words to protect themselves. However, recording the dead revealed a terrifying new reality for the survivors. The registers showed a mathematical disaster. There were not enough workers. In the 1370s and 1380s, the registers showed page after page of dead ploughmen, dead bakers, dead millers. But the grain still needed to be harvested. The bread still needed to be baked. The survivors looked around and realized something incredible. They realized their value had skyrocketed. If you are the only carpenter left in the village, you do not have to beg for work. The work begs for you. You can ask for higher wages. You can demand better food. You can refuse to bow down to the lord of the manor. The records that were meant to control the chaos actually revealed the power of the common people. The ruling elite, the knights, the bishops, the rich merchants, looked at the same registers and felt a different kind of fear. They were not afraid of the disease anymore. They were afraid of the poor. They were afraid that the lower orders were forgetting their place. In the next part, we will see the inevitable clash. We will see what happens when the institutions try to force the economy back to the way it was before the plague. We will see the government try to ban high wages. We will see them try to freeze time. And we will see the people explode. We are moving from the quiet scratching of the clerk's pen to the roar of the angry mob. The quiet scratching of the clerk's pen in the church register hit a loud and dangerous reality outside. The names in the book were dead, but the fields were alive with anger. Imagine a wheat field in Essex in the late 1370s. It is August. The wheat is tall and golden. It is ready to be cut. If it is not cut in the next 3 days, the rain will come and ruin the bread for the entire winter. The lord of the manor rides out on his horse. He sees a group of peasants sitting by the side of the road. They are holding their scythes, the curved blades used for harvesting. They are not working. They are eating cheese and laughing. The Lord shouts at them, "Why is the wheat standing?" One of the men, a reaper, stands up slowly. He does not take off his hat. This is already an insult. He looks the Lord in the eye. "We will cut it," the reaper says, "but the price is 6 pence a day, and lunch, and ale." The Lord turns red. Before the plague, the price was 2 pence. 6 pence is robbery. It is a scandal. But the Lord looks at the sky. He sees the gray clouds gathering. He has no choice. He pays the 6 pence. But as he rides away, he does not feel defeated. He feels vindictive. He rides straight to the courthouse. He is going to use the new weapon of the elite. He is going to use the statute. This brings us to a critical word for understanding legal history. A statute is a written law passed by a legislative body. The statute of laborers tried to freeze wages. The King's Council issued a new statute against vagrants. In the 1350s, the English government panicked. They saw the wages rising. They saw the peasants wearing better clothes and eating better meat. They believed this was against God's order. So they passed the Statute of Laborers. This law was simple and brutal. It stated that everyone under the age of 60 must work. And, this is the key part, they must work for the same wages they received in 1346, before the plague arrived. Let us define wages. Wages are a fixed, regular payment, typically paid on a daily or weekly basis. The laborers demanded higher wages for the harvest. The government was trying to do something impossible. They were trying to repeal the law of supply and demand. The supply of workers was low because they were dead. The demand for workers was high because the crops were still growing. Therefore, the price of labor, wages, had to go up. It is basic economics. But the medieval mind did not see economics. It saw greed. In the 1370s, the enforcement of this statute became a war. The justices of the peace, local judges who were often landowners themselves, held sessions 4 times a year. They hauled the reapers and the ploughmen into court. "You took 6 pence!" the judge would shout. "I have to eat," the the peasant would reply. The judge would then impose a fine. A fine is a sum of money exacted as a penalty by a court of law or other authority. The reaper paid a heavy fine for demanding extra money. Thousands of people were fined. If they could not pay, they were put in the stocks. Wooden frames that locked their ankles or wrists in the town square. It was public humiliation. This conflict reveals the dark side of institutions. We often think of institutions as things that help us. Hospitals, schools, libraries. But in the late 14th century, institutions were often weapons used by the rich to crush the poor. The rule of law was not neutral. It was a net designed to catch the small fish, while the big fish swam through. Why do I say the big fish swam through? Because the lords were hypocrites. Remember the lord in the wheat field? He paid the sixpence because he needed the harvest. He broke the law too. But he was rarely punished. The records show that the fines fell overwhelmingly on the workers. This created a deep, simmering resentment. The peasants were not stupid. They saw the injustice. They saw the clerks writing down their names in the fines column of the court rolls. They began to realize that the record was not just a list. It was a chain. By the late 1370s, the tension in England was unbearable. The plague kept coming back. The taxes kept going up to pay for a losing war in France. And the local courts kept fining the villagers for trying to survive. The government thought they were creating order. They thought that by writing down the rules and enforcing the fines, they were saving society. They were wrong. They were building a pressure cooker, and they had clamped the lid down too tight. There is a concept in history called social friction. It is the heat created when two groups rub against each other. In 1370s London, the friction was between the record keepers, the officials, the lawyers, the scribes, and the wage earners, the craftsmen, the laborers. The wage earners had a new sense of worth. They had survived the apocalypse. They felt invincible. Who was a man with a pen to tell them what they were worth? Why should I work for 2 pence when I can get 4 in the next village? This question terrified the authorities. It meant the old feudal system, where you were born on the land and stayed on the land, was breaking. In the next part, we will see the most spectacular failure of this institutional control. We will see what happens when the government tries to count not just the dead and not just the wages, but the heads of the living. We will look at a specific tax that was the spark for an explosion. It is called the poll tax. And we will see how the people of London did not just ignore the records. They burned them. In 1380, the English Parliament did something desperate. They needed money for the war in France. They had taxed the wool. They had taxed the land. They had run out of things to tax. So, they decided to tax the most basic thing of all, existence. They created the poll tax. The word poll is an Old English word for head. This was a tax on heads. It did not matter if you were rich or poor. It did not matter if you owned a castle or a pigsty. If you were over the age of 15, you had to pay 1 shilling. To a rich merchant, 1 shilling was nothing. It was the price of a good dinner. To a peasant laborer, 1 shilling was 3 days of back-breaking work. It was the difference between eating and starving. This brings us to a crucial term in our story of institutions: unfair. Unfair means not following the rules of justice or equality. The peasants believed the poll tax was deeply unfair, but the government did not care about fairness. They cared about the revenue. Revenue is income, especially when of a company or organization and of a substantial nature. The King's Council needed revenue to pay the soldiers. In the spring of 1381, the tax collectors rode out from London. They carried their rolls of parchment. They rode into the villages of Essex and Kent. They set up tables in the village greens. They demanded that the villagers line up. "Name?" the collector asked. "John Smith." "Wife?" "Mary." "Children over 15? The villagers lied. They hid their daughters in the woods. They said their sons were only 12. They tried to vanish from the record. The collectors were not stupid. They looked at the numbers. The population of England seemed to have shrunk overnight. They knew the peasants were hiding, so they sent the collectors back. This time, they were aggressive. The fear of the plague had turned into a fear of the institution. And now, the fear turned into rage. The fear of the plague had turned into a fear of the institution. And now, the fear turned into rage. In June 1381, the Peasants' Revolt began. It was the first great popular rebellion in English history. But notice what they attacked. They did not just attack the people, they attacked the records. When the rebels marched into London, they did not go to the shops to steal jewels. They went to the Temple, the center of the law. They went to the Savoy Palace, the home of the most hated duke. They broke into the offices of the clerks. They grabbed the court rolls, the heavy parchment scrolls we talked about in Part 3. They grabbed the tax registers. They grabbed the lists of fines. They piled them in the streets. They set them on fire. Why? Because they understood the power of the written word. As long as those records existed, they were serfs. They were debtors. They were criminals. But if the fire turned the parchment to ash, the record was gone. The debt was gone. The past was erased. It was a war against the bureaucracy. The rebels shouted, "Kill all the lawyers!" They believed that the lawyers and the clerks were the ones weaving the nets of the law. They believed that if they could destroy the institutions, they could return to a simpler, freer time. This was a violent, chaotic moment, but it teaches us something profound about English society in the late 1300s. The people were no longer just subjects who obeyed blindly. They were becoming political. They were debating the ideas of freedom and rights. Listen to the sermon of John Ball, a radical priest who marched with the rebels. He asked a question that shook the foundations of the medieval world. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? He meant, in the beginning, when Adam dug the earth and Eve spun the wool, there were no lords, there were no serfs, we were all equal. Why are we not equal now? This is the voice of the commoner. A commoner is an ordinary person without rank or title. The commoners demanded the end of serfdom. The revolt was terrifying for the young King Richard II. He was only 14 years old. He looked out from the Tower of London and saw his capital city burning. He saw the heads of his advisors stuck on pikes on London Bridge. The king rode out to meet the rebels at Smithfield. It was a tense standoff. The leader of the rebels Wat Tyler was confident, maybe too confident. He spoke to the king as an equal. He demanded that all men should be free. He demanded that the price of land be lowered. He demanded the repeal of the statute of laborer. Then, in a flash of violence, Wat Tyler was stabbed by the mayor of London. The rebels drew their bows. They were ready to shoot the king. But Richard II rode toward them. "I will be your captain," he shouted. He promised them pardons. He promised them freedom. He promised to abolish the serfdom. The rebels believed him. They went home. They were naive. As soon as the rebels dispersed, the king's army rode out. The promises were broken. The pardons were revoked. The executioners got to work. "Serfs you were," the king reportedly said, "and serfs you shall remain." The revolt was crushed. The leaders were hanged. The records were rewritten. The institutions won. But something had changed forever. The ruling class had looked into the abyss. They had seen that the mob had power. They realized that they could not just push and push and push. The cost of enforcing the statute of laborers was becoming too high. The revolt failed as a military operation, but it succeeded as a warning. In the years that followed 1381, the strict laws about wages began to fade, not because they were repealed, but because they were impossible to enforce. The lords quietly started paying higher wages because they didn't want their manor houses burned down. The institution learned a lesson. You need consent. Consent is permission for something to happen, or agreement to do something. The government realized they needed the consent of the people to collect taxes efficiently. The plague had killed the people. The laws had angered the survivors. The fire had burned the records. Now, as we move into the 1390s, a new kind of institution begins to emerge. It is not about brute force. It is about management. It is about sanitation. It is about cooperation. The cities realized that to survive the recurring plague, they needed to work with the citizens, not just against them. In the next part, we will see how this new spirit of management transformed the physical city. We will look at the water. We will look at the butchers. We will look at the latrines. We are going to learn the vocabulary of infrastructure. In the heat of a London summer in the 1390s, you did not need a map to find the meat market. You just needed a nose. If you walked down Newgate Street, near St. Paul's Cathedral, the air became thick. It tasted of iron and rot. You were entering the shambles. This was the district where the butchers worked. Hundreds of cows and sheep were slaughtered here every day to feed the hungry city. But where did the blood go? Where did the intestines go? For centuries, the answer was the street or the river. The butchers would drag the offal, the internal organs, through the lanes and dump it into the Fleet River or the Thames. The water turned red. The smell was so bad that monks in nearby churches claimed they could not pray. They said the stench was killing them. And in the late 14th century, remember, they believed smell was the killer. The miasma theory meant that a bad smell was not just annoying, it was a weapon. This brings us to the year 1388. This is a pivotal year for our story of institutions. The English Parliament, meeting in Cambridge, passed the first nationwide sanitary law in English history. It is often called the Statute of Cambridge. Listen to the specific vocabulary of this law. It forbade the casting of dung, garbage, guts, and other ordure into ditches, rivers, and waters. The word ordure is an old word for excrement or filth. The streets were filled with animal ordure. But laws are just paper. As we saw with the Statute of Laborers, a law without a system is useless. The difference in the 1390s was that the city began to build physical systems to solve the problem. We're talking about infrastructure. Infrastructure refers to the basic physical and organizational structures needed for the operation of a society. The Roman aqueducts were a marvel of infrastructure. London needed new sanitation infrastructure to fight the plague. The most famous piece of infrastructure in medieval London was the Great Conduit. It was not a sewer, it was the opposite. It was a system of lead pipes that brought fresh, sweet water from springs in the countryside, Tyburn, all the way to the center of the city, Cheapside. Imagine a stone fountain in the middle of a busy market. It is the only source of clean water for thousands of people. In the 1390s, the city realized that this water was precious. It was life. So they created a job, the keeper of the conduit. This man was not a guard. He was an engineer. He had to check the pipes. He had to clean the filters. He had to make sure the brewers and fishmongers didn't steal all the water for their businesses. This is maintenance. Maintenance is the process of maintaining or preserving someone or something. The maintenance of the water pipes cost the city £40 a year. If the pipes broke, the city died. So, the city council began to tax people specifically for the repair of the conduit. They treated the water system like we treat the electrical grid today. It was a public utility. But the city also had to deal with the waste. Enter one of the most famous names in London history, Richard Whittington. You might know him from the nursery rhyme, Dick Whittington and His Cat. The story says he was a poor boy who became Lord Mayor of London 3 times. The history shows he was a very wealthy merchant who understood the power of institutions. Whittington lived through the worst plague years. When he became mayor in the late 1390s and early 1400s, he did not build a statue of himself. He built a toilet. He financed a massive public latrine known as Whittington's Longhouse. It sat over the river Walbrook. It had 64 seats, separated for men and women. It was flushed by the tide of the river. This was not just generosity, it was public health policy. Whittington understood that if the poor people had nowhere to go, they would go in the street. And if they went in the street, the miasma would return. And if the miasma returned, the rich people would die too. This is the cooperation we spoke of. It was a selfish cooperation, perhaps, but it worked. To manage all this, the butchers, the pipes, the latrines, the city relied on a system of local government called the ward mote. A ward is an administrative division of a city. London was divided into 24 wards. A mote, or moot, is an old word for a meeting. The ward mote was a neighborhood meeting. It was where the institution met the individual. Imagine a crowded hall. The alderman, the leader of the ward, sits at the front. The local shopkeepers and householders sit on benches. They are angry. "John the baker is heating his oven with stinky straw," one man shouts.
"Alice is throwing her washwater out the window,"
says another. "The pavement in front of the tanner's house is broken." The clerk writes it all down. These complaints were called presentments. we present that John Smith has a dung heap at his door. If you were presented at the ward mote, you were fined, you were shamed, you were forced to fix it. This system turned every neighbor into a spy. It turned every citizen into a health inspector. It was not the king's soldiers marching down the street. It was your own neighbor watching you. And this is how a city becomes civilized. It is not just about art and music. It is about the peer pressure to keep the street clean. The vocabulary of the ward mote was full of the word nuisance. A nuisance is a person, thing, or circumstance causing inconvenience or annoyance. In law, it is an act that causes offense or injury to the public. The smell from the slaughterhouse was declared a public nuisance. By the year 1400, London had a list of nuisances a mile long. You could not let your pigs roam free. You could not melt tallow, animal fat, during the day. You could not block the gutter. The city was tightening up. The fear of the 1348 apocalypse had evolved into a strict, nagging, paperwork-heavy culture of rule. But there was one group of people who did not fit into this new order. They were not merchants. They were not laborers. They were the people who had given up on the world entirely. They were the religious fanatics, the flagellants, the mystics. While the city council was building latrines and writing laws, a spiritual movement was growing in the shadows. They believed that no amount of cleaning would save the city. They believed the only way to stop the plague was to suffer. In the next part, we will leave the noise of the ward mote and enter the silence of the monastery. We will look at how the church, the oldest institution of all, was fracturing under the pressure of the plague. We will meet the Lollards, the heretics who began to question the ultimate authority. We will see that while the bodies were being counted, the souls were being lost. While the Mayor of London was busy cleaning the streets of animal dung, the Bishop of London was trying to clean something much harder to reach: the human soul. But the tools he had were broken. Imagine you are a villager in 1390. You have survived 3 waves of the plague. You have seen your children die. You have seen your neighbors die. You go to the church for comfort. You want to know why God is doing this. But the priest is not the wise old man you knew as a child. That man died in 1349. The new priest is young. He can barely read Latin. He rushes through the prayers. And worst of all, he seems more interested in collecting your tithe money than saving your spirit. This brings us to a critical word: corruption. Corruption is dishonest or fraudulent conduct by those in power. The peasants complained about the corruption of the clergy. The Black Death did not just kill bodies, it killed the reputation of the church. The church was the ultimate institution of the Middle Ages. It held the keys to heaven. But during the plague, many priests ran away. They fled to the country to save themselves, leaving the dying to face death alone. The survivors remembered this. They felt betrayed. And when trust in an institution collapses, people start to look for alternatives. They start to ask dangerous questions. In the late 1300s, a new movement began to spread in England. They were called the Lollards. The Lollards were followers of a philosopher named John Wycliffe. They looked at the rich bishops with their gold rings and fur robes, and then they looked at the Bible. They saw that Jesus was poor. They saw a contradiction. They began to say things that were shocking. They said the church should not own property.
They said the Pope was not the voice of God. They said, and this was the most dangerous idea of all,
that ordinary people should be able to read the Bible in English. To the authorities, this was not just a different opinion, it was heresy. Heresy is belief or opinion contrary to orthodox religious doctrine.
The bishop declared the preacher's words to be heresy.
He was accused of spreading heresy among the poor. The Lollards were like the rats of the spiritual world in the eyes of the church. They were spreading a disease of the mind. And just like the city council used quarantine to stop the plague, the church used the law to stop the heretics. Here we see the fear to institutions theme perfectly. The fear of religious chaos led to strict new laws. In 1401, the king and the church joined forces to pass a terrifying statute, De heretico comburendo. That is Latin for, on the burning of heretics. This law created a bureaucratic process for burning people alive. Before this, if you disagreed with the church, you might be excommunicated, kicked out. Now, you could be handed over to the sheriff. The sheriff would take you to a high place in the market. He would chain you to a stake. He would light the wood. This was the ultimate form of censorship. Censorship is the suppression or prohibition of any parts of books, films, news, etc. that are considered obscene, politically unacceptable, or a threat to security. The church used censorship to stop the English Bible from being printed. Why did the state care? Why did the king get involved in a religious argument? Because the Lollards were not just attacking the church. They were attacking the hierarchy. Hierarchy is a system or organization in which people or groups are ranked one above the other according to status or authority. The plague threatened to destroy the social hierarchy. If a peasant could read the Bible and decide what it meant, then maybe he could read the law and decide what it meant. If he didn't need a priest to get to heaven, maybe he didn't need a lord to govern the land. The authorities saw a direct line between the Lollards and the peasants' revolt. They saw independent thinking as a virus. So the institutions clamped down. The bishops began to hold inquisitions. They summoned people to court. Did you eat meat on Friday? Did you read a book in English? Did you say the priest is a sinner? The records from these trials are fascinating. They show ordinary people, weavers, skinners, housewives, arguing with theology experts. They show a population that had become tough, cynical, and articulate. The plague had forced them to grow up. They had seen the worst that death could do. They were no longer afraid of a priest's threat of hell. They were living in hell already. One Lollard, a woman named Hoisia Moon, was brought before the Bishop of Norwich. She told him that the Pope was the Antichrist. She told him that she would not bow to a wooden statue because it is just dead wood, like the wood in my kitchen. She was forced to recant. She had to walk through the market in her underwear, carrying a candle, while people whipped her. This was the theater of punishment. It was designed to restore order. It was designed to show that the institution was still in charge. But just like the statute of laborers failed to stop wages from rising, the burning of heretics failed to stop people from thinking. The Lollards went underground. They met in secret cellars. They memorized whole books of the Bible, so they wouldn't get caught carrying a book. They became an invisible network. By the early 1400s, England was a changed place. It was cleaner, yes. The streets had rakers. The butchers had rules. The wills were registered. But it was also quieter, tenser, and more suspicious. The old medieval joy, the chaotic, messy communal life, was being replaced by a new, colder efficiency. The individual was emerging from the crowd, and the state was building a cage to hold him. In the next part, we will look at how this new efficiency changed the physical landscape of the English countryside. We will leave the city and go to the farms. We will see how the lack of workers forced the lords to stop growing wheat and start growing something else. Something that didn't need to be fed, something that didn't ask for wages. Something that changed the English economy forever. We are going to talk about wool, and we will see how the enclosure of the land began. A lone man sits on a hill in Gloucestershire, looking down at a valley. It is 1395. 10 years ago, this valley was full of people. There were 20 families. There were children playing in the dirt. There were cows being milked. Today, there is only grass. And sheep. Thousands of sheep. The village is gone. The houses have been pulled down. The church is empty, its roof falling in. The people have been evicted. This is the silent tragedy of the late 14th century. It is called depopulation. Depopulation is the substantial reduction in the population of an area. The plague caused the depopulation of many rural villages. But it wasn't just the disease that emptied the villages. It was the landlords. A landlord is a person who rents land, a building, or an apartment to a tenant. The landlord decided to switch from farming to grazing. Here is the economic logic. Before the plague, labor was cheap. You had plenty of peasants to plow the fields, sow the seeds, and harvest the grain. Grain was labor-intensive. You needed many hands. After the plague, labor was expensive. The peasants demanded high wages, as we saw in Part 4. The cost of farming went up. The profit from grain went down. But sheep are easy. One shepherd and a good dog can watch 1,000 sheep. So the landlords did the math. They realized they could make more money by evicting the remaining peasants and turning the arable land for crops, into pasture, land for grazing. They built fences, they planted hedges. They enclosed the common land that the villagers had used for centuries. This process is known as enclosure. Enclosure is the act of seizing land and putting a hedge or fence around it. Enclosure forced many peasants to leave their homes. The wool from these sheep was white gold. It was the oil of the Middle Ages. English wool was the best in Europe. It was shipped to Flanders and Italy to be made into fine cloth. The landlords became incredibly rich, but the social cost was immense. Imagine the conversation between a landlord and a tenant farmer. "I have lived here all my life," the farmer says. "My father died here." "I am sorry," the landlord replies, "but I need the land for the flock." "Where will I go?" "To the city, to London, to Bristol. There is work there." This was the Great Migration. The displaced rural poor flooded into the towns. They arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They moved into the crowded tenements. They looked for work as day laborers. This influx of people put even more pressure on the city institutions. The sanitation laws we discussed in Part 6 became even more critical. The risk of disease in the overcrowded slums skyrocketed. But the city needed them. The city was a machine that consumed people. The death rate in London was always higher than the birth rate. The only way London grew was by migration from the countryside. So, the enclosure in the country fed the urbanization in the city. The wool trade also created a new class of powerful men, the merchants. A merchant is a person or company involved in wholesale trade, especially one dealing with foreign countries or supplying merchandise to a particular trade. The wool merchant became wealthier than the old nobility. These merchants were not like the old feudal lords. They did not care about knights or castles. They cared about profit. They cared about efficiency. They were the ones who pushed for better roads, safer seas, and clearer laws. They built beautiful churches. They built guild halls. They built schools. But their charity was often calculated. They wanted a stable society where business could flourish. This shift from land to money is one of the most important changes in English history. In the past, power came from how many acres you owned. Now, power came from how much credit you had with the Italian bankers. This new economy required a new kind of education. A knight needed to know how to ride a horse and swing a sword. A merchant needed to know how to read, write, and do arithmetic. So, in the late 1300s, we see a boom in education. Education is the process of receiving or giving systematic instruction, especially at a school or university. The merchant sent his son to school to learn Latin and accounting. Grammar schools began to pop up in towns across England. They were not for the very poor, but for the sons of the middle class, the yeomen, the shopkeepers, the clerks. These schools taught them how to draft a contract, how to calculate interest, how to speak persuasively. This was the beginning of the professional class. These were the men who would eventually run the government. They were the ancestors of the civil service. By the year 1400, England was becoming a nation of shopkeepers and bureaucrats. The romance of the Middle Ages, the tournaments, the chivalry, was fading. It was being replaced by the ledger book and the wool sack. The fear of the plague had not disappeared, but it had been channeled into a new kind of energy, the energy of commerce, the energy of ambition. People realized that life was short. Memento mori, remember you will die, was the motto of the age. But instead of paralyzing them, it motivated them. If I am going to die soon, the merchant thought, I might as well make my fortune now. I might as well build a big house. I might as well leave a legacy. This drive, this frantic need to achieve before the end, is the psychological engine of the modern world. In the next part, we will look at how this new wealth and new literacy led to a cultural explosion. We will meet a man who worked as a customs official in the Port of London. He checked the wool exports. He counted the sheepskins. But at night, he wrote poetry. He wrote the first great masterpiece of the English language. His name was Geoffrey Chaucer. And his book, The Canterbury Tales, is the ultimate record of this new, messy, vibrant society. We will see how English became the language of the people, and how stories became a way to process the trauma of the past 50 years. In 1374, a man sat in a small wooden room above the wool wharf in London. It was noisy. It smelled of wet sheep and raw leather. His job was boring. He had to weigh every sack of wool that left the port.
He had to check the wax seals. He had to write the numbers in a ledger. He was a government official, a bureaucrat. A bureaucrat is an official in a government department, especially one perceived as being concerned with procedural correctness at the expense of people's needs. The bureaucrat checked the paperwork 3 times. This man's name was Geoffrey Chaucer. To the men on the dock, he was just the controller. He was the face of the institution. He was the man who made sure the king got his tax money, the customs, from the wool trade we discussed in the last part. But inside this bureaucrat's head, a different kind of accounting was happening. He was not just counting sacks of wool. He was counting the people. He was listening to their voices. He was recording their souls. When he went home at night, he did not write in Latin, the language of the church. He did not write in French, the language of the king and the court. He wrote in English. This was a revolutionary choice. For 300 years, since the Norman conquest of 1066, English had been the language of the peasants. It was considered low. It was the language of the barn, not the library. But the plague had changed the demographics of England. The French-speaking nobility had died in huge numbers. The English-speaking laborers had survived and risen in power. The 2 languages were boiling together in the pot of London. Chaucer decided to write in the vernacular. Vernacular is the language or dialect spoken by the ordinary people in a particular country or region. Chaucer chose to write in the English vernacular so everyone could understand. His masterpiece, the Canterbury Tales, is the ultimate record of the late 14th century. It is not a list of deaths. It is a list of lives. The story is simple. A group of 30 people meets at the Tabard Inn in Southwark, just across the bridge from London. They are going on a pilgrimage to Canterbury to visit the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. A pilgrimage is a journey to a place associated with someone or something well known or respected. The pilgrimage to the holy shrine was dangerous but popular. Look at who is in the group. It is a cross-section of the society we have been studying. There is a knight, the old feudal order. There is a merchant, the new money. There is a clerk, the record keeper. There is a miller, the loud, aggressive worker. There is a doctor who got rich during the plague. There is a pardoner, the corrupt church official. Chaucer brings them all together. In real life, these people might not talk to each other, but on the road, in the shadow of the plague, social barriers break down. They tell stories to pass the time. Chaucer uses satire. Satire is the use of humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule to expose and criticize people's stupidity or vices. The poet used satire to mock the greed of the church. He describes the pardoner, a man who sells fake holy relics to poor people. He sells pig bones and claims they are the bones of saints. Chaucer exposes the institution of the church as a fraud. He describes the reeve, a manager of a country estate. The reeve is skinny, angry, and sharp. He knows every trick the peasants use to hide their grain. He is the human embodiment of the audit. Chaucer shows us that while the institutions were getting stronger, the people running them were often flawed, greedy, or hilarious. This is the genius of the 1390s. The fear of death had created a desire for life. The survivors wanted to laugh. They wanted to drink. They wanted to tell dirty jokes. The Canterbury Tales is full of toilet humor. It is bawdy. It is rude. It celebrates the human body, eating, drinking, sex, and yes, defecating. Why? because the body was the battlefield of the plague. By laughing at the body, they were reclaiming it from the disease. Chaucer also captured the sound of the new English language. Listen to the opening lines in the original Middle English. Wan that April with his showers soote, the droughtè of March hath pursed to the rootè. It is not a list of deaths, it is a list of lives. The story is simple. A group of 30 people meets at the Tabard Inn in Southwark, just across the bridge from London. They are going on a pilgrimage to Canterbury to visit the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. A pilgrimage is a journey to a place associated with someone or something well known or respected. The pilgrimage to the holy shrine was dangerous, but popular. Look at who is in the group. It is a cross-section of the society we have been studying. There is a knight, the old feudal order. There is a merchant, the new money. There is a clerk, the record keeper. There is a miller, the loud, aggressive worker. There is a doctor, who got rich during the plague. There is a pardoner, the corrupt church official. Chaucer brings them all together. In real life, these people might not talk to each other, but on the road, in the shadow of the plague, social barriers break down. They tell stories to pass the time. Chaucer uses satire. Satire is the use of humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule to expose and criticize people's stupidity or vices. The poet used satire to mock the greed of the church. He describes the pardoner, a man who sells fake holy relics to poor people. He sells pig bones and claims they are the bones of saints. Chaucer exposes the institution of the church as a fraud. He describes the reeve, a manager of a country estate. The reeve is skinny, angry, and sharp. He knows every trick the peasants use to hide their grain. He is the human embodiment of the audit. Chaucer shows us that while the institutions were getting stronger, the people running them were often flawed, greedy, or hilarious. This is the genius of the 1390s. The fear of death had created a desire for life. The survivors wanted to laugh. They wanted to drink. They wanted to tell dirty jokes. The Canterbury Tales is full of toilet humor. It is bawdy. It is rude. It celebrates the human body, eating, drinking, sex, and yes, defecating. Why? Because the body was the battlefield of the plague. By laughing at the body, they were reclaiming it from the disease. Chaucer also captured the sound of the new English language. Listen to the opening lines in the original Middle English. One that April with his shores suit, the drought of March hath pursed to the root. When April with its sweet showers slash, the drought of March has pierced to the root. It sounds different from modern English, but you can hear the rhythm. It is the rhythm of our speech today. By writing this down, Chaucer did for the language what the clerks did for the law. He standardized it. He gave it prestige. He made it an institution. Before Chaucer, English was a mess of dialects. A man from the north could barely understand a man from the south. After Chaucer, and the printing press that followed later, the London dialect became the standard. This is the power of the record. If you write something down well enough, it becomes the truth. Chaucer died in 1400. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, not because he was a poet, but because he was a loyal servant of the king. He was a clerk of the works. He oversaw the repair of walls and ditches. He was a man of the 1370s to 1400s, practical, bureaucratic, careful with money, but deeply aware of the absurdity of life. As we reach the year 1400, we see a complete transformation of English society. In 1348, the response to crisis was screaming. In 1400, the response to crisis was a committee meeting. The panic had been replaced by procedure. The great mortality had become a line item in a budget. The dead were no longer anonymous piles of bones. They were names in a parish register. The English people had learned that they could not stop the plague, but they could manage it. They could build walls around it, legal walls, stone walls, and linguistic walls. However, just as the century turned, a political earthquake hit. The king, Richard II, the boy who faced the peasants in 1381, had grown into a tyrant. He believed he was above the law. He forgot the lesson of the institutions: consent. He confiscated land without due process. He ignored the parliament. So the institutions struck back. In 1399, his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, returned from exile. The nobles rallied around him. The merchants of London opened the gates to him. The bureaucrats switched sides. Richard II was deposed. He was thrown into a dungeon in Pontefract Castle, where he quietly starved to death. Henry became King Henry IV. This was not just a coup, it was a victory for the system. It proved that even the king was not bigger than the state. In the final part of our documentary, we will look back at this incredible 30-year period. We will summarize the journey from the terror of the 1370s to the structured society of 1400. We will see how the rule of law, the idea that a written rule is more powerful than a sword, became the defining characteristic of the modern world. And we will ask one final question. Did these institutions actually save us? Or did they just teach us how to die more quietly? It is the year 1400. We are standing on the same dock in London where we began our journey. The smell of the river is still there. The gray clouds are still there. But look closer at the scene. A ship has just arrived from Venice. The captain does not just jump onto the dock and embrace his wife. He stands at the rail. He holds up a piece of parchment sealed with wax. It is a fede di sanità, a faith of health. It certifies that his ship is clean. A man on the dock, wearing the livery of the city council, takes the paper. He reads it. He nods. He waves the ship in. There is no screaming. There is no panic. There is just a stamped document and a nod. This silence is the ending of our story. In this final part, we look at the legacy of the years 1370 to 1400. We will see how the chaos of the Black Death was tamed not by medicine, but by bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is a system of government in which most of the important decisions are made by state officials rather than by elected representatives. The bureaucracy of the city managed the food supply. We have traveled a long road. We started in the terror of the 1340s, where the only response to the plague was to run or pray. We saw how that fear transformed into something useful. We saw the birth of the ordinance in Ragusa, creating the 40-day quarantine. We saw the rise of the record in the parish churches, counting the dead. We saw the statutes that tried to control wages and the revolt that burned the archives. We saw the infrastructure of clean water and public latrines. We saw the enclosure of the countryside and the standardization of the English language. All of these things, every single one, were reactions to the trauma of the pestilence. The people of the late 14th century realized that they could not kill the disease. They did not have antibiotics. but they realized they could build a cage around it. That cage was built of laws, lists, and walls. This brings us to the concept of resilience. Resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. Toughness. The resilience of the Londoners allowed them to rebuild after the plague. But their resilience was not just about being tough. It was about being smart. It was about adaptation. Adaptation is the action or process of adapting or being adapted. The adaptation of new health laws saved thousands of lives. Think about your own life today. When you register your car, when you file your taxes, when you show your ID at an airport, you are participating in a system that was refined during these dark years. The medieval mind learned that freedom without rules was a death sentence. In a crowded city, my freedom to be dirty violates your freedom to be healthy. So, they invented the public sphere. They invented the idea that the government has a right to look inside your house, check your pipes, and count your children. It sounds intrusive. It sounds cold. But it is the price of civilization. In the year 1400, London was a fortress of rules. The mayor, the aldermen, the guild masters, they formed a web of control. Did it work? The plague did not disappear. It returned to London every 20 years for the next 3 centuries. It returned in 1665 for the Great Plague, but it never again caused the total societal collapse of 1348.